January 1944. Over northern France, the sky is a cage of smoke and sunlight. A B-17 formation pushes toward its target. Engines thundering, gun barrels trembling in the icy wind. Inside the waist position, Staff Sergeant Charles Edwards braces his boots against the deck, his gloved hands gripping the twin. 50s. A Messerschmitt 109 flashes across the horizon, a black cross slicing through the pale cloud. Instinct screams to aim at it. But Edwards doesn't. His sight drifts a hair behind the enemy's path, where, by all reason, no plane should be. He squeezes the trigger. The guns roar. Tracers streak into empty air. Then, half a heartbeat later, tear through the Messerschmitt's wing root. It shudders, folds, and falls away in silence. Edwards exhales. Around him, hundreds of other gunners follow the same rule: aim not at what you see, but at where the enemy will be. A paradox born of physics and perfected by war. The unforgiving geometry of air combat. At the dawn of the Second World War, air combat was still ruled by instinct. Pilots and gunners across all nations believed what seemed most natural: aim directly at the target you can see. The logic felt sound. The human eye and brain are wired to fixate on motion and center it in the sights. But air combat operates in a realm where human intuition falters. Speeds exceeded 300 miles per hour. Distances closed faster than the mind could compute, and bullets took whole fractions of a second to reach their mark. In that brief delay, a target could move dozens of meters. To aim at an enemy was, quite often, to miss entirely. In 1939 and 1940, as the Luftwaffe swept across Europe, the British and French air forces learned that most gunnery hits came not from precision but from proximity and luck. American observers noted the same. U.S. military attachés returning from Britain carried back grim reports. Even the best trained fighter pilots often needed hundreds of rounds to bring down a single aircraft. For bomber gunners, who fought from vibrating gun turrets, through glass and smoke, accuracy was worse still. The core problem was geometry. Every aerial engagement was a moving triangle: the shooter, the target, and the bullet's invisible arc. But in those early years, few truly understood the mathematics of deflection. How far ahead or behind to aim, depending on range, angle, and closure speed. Training manuals emphasized tracking fire. Follow the target, keep it centered, and squeeze short bursts. It worked in theory, rarely in practice. The Luftwaffe's experience in Spain had already produced more advanced gunnery training. German pilots drilled relentlessly with sign guns, film cameras mounted in place of machine guns, to teach visual lead correction. The U.S. Army Air Corps had nothing comparable. When America entered the war in December 1941, its airmen faced the same dilemma that had haunted every early Air Force: how to train a human brain to predict motion faster than it could think. The first U.S. bomber groups deployed to England in 1942, with thousands of gunners who had never fired a live round at a moving aircraft. They practiced on towed sleeves or ground targets, both stationary or predictable. The shock came in combat, when German fighters slashed in from angles and speeds they'd never experienced. Early mission reports read like confessions. Enemy approached at 2 o'clock low. Fired several bursts. No visible hits. Crews returned shaken, their ammunition spent, their claims uncertain. For every German fighter downed, dozens of American gunners had fired in vain. The Air Force realized it was fighting not just an enemy, but its own physiology. The human tendency to shoot at what the eye can see instead of what physics demands. So the U.S. Army Air Forces launched a revolution in training. In early 1943, the flexible gunnery schools at places like Las Vegas and Harlingen, Texas, became laboratories of perception. Cadets practiced with moving clay pigeons, with mechanical target tracks, and, most importantly, with film simulators showing attacking fighters on screen. Instructors taught deflection angles and time of flight in measurable terms. At 400 yards, with a fighter closing at 350 miles per hour, lead 2 full aircraft lengths behind the apparent image. The phrasing puzzled many behind. The term referred not to the physical aircraft, but to the perceived motion through the gunner's sight. Due to tracer lag and parallax error, the bullets appeared to trail the fighter even when perfectly aimed. The correct technique, counterintuitive but deadly accurate, required aiming where the target seemed to have already been. By mid-1943, that doctrine, aiming behind the apparent image, had become standard in both bomber and fighter training. The results would soon rewrite air combat statistics. But before the transformation took hold, American gunners had to first understand the science that made their instincts wrong, the mathematics of lead and lag. To understand why American gunners learned to aim behind, one must first grasp the cruel simplicity of physics. Every bullet, no matter how fast, obeys time. Fired from a Browning M2, the 50 caliber machine gun, a round leaves the barrel at roughly 2,900 feet per second. In the split second it takes to travel a few hundred yards, a fighter moving at 400 miles per hour may have already shifted tens of meters in space. That fleeting interval, invisible to the eye, is the essence of aerial gunnery. A stationary shooter can aim at what he sees. A moving shooter cannot. In the air, both aircraft and bullets are moving within constantly shifting vectors. Angles of attack, turn rates, and closure speeds. Hitting a target requires deflection, predicting where the enemy will be when the bullets arrive. But human vision lags by fractions of a second, and tracer rounds, meant to correct aim, introduce their own deception. Tracers burn slower than the bullet's flight path, making it appear that rounds arc or trail behind their mark. A gunner who corrects visually, following the tracer, may unconsciously aim too far ahead. The paradoxical training order: aim slightly behind the visible target, compensated for this illusion. Technological change magnified the challenge. Before the war, most aircraft relied on simple ring and bead sights, essentially glorified iron sights adapted for open cockpits. Pilots had to estimate deflection using experience alone. The British introduced the reflector sight in the late 1930s, which projected a glowing reticle onto glass, allowing pilots to superimpose aim points without parallax. But even this did not calculate lead. It merely made aiming more intuitive. The American adoption of reflector sights, followed by gyro, stabilized models like the K-14, finally integrated mechanical prediction. These sights used gyroscopes to sense turn rate and automatically shift the reticle to where the pilot should fire, effectively codifying the principle of aiming away from the target's visible position. Bomber gunners faced a different equation. The B-17's turrets, whether chin dorsal or tail mounted, were stabilized platforms with limited traverse speeds. A fighter attacking at oblique angles could cross the gunner's field of fire in under 2 seconds. To score hits, gunners had to lead not only horizontally, but vertically, accounting for bullet drop, aircraft vibration, and the time delay of firing solenoids. Training diagrams resembled trigonometry lessons: deflection angle on one axis, target speed and range on another. Charts instructed: for an FW-190 approaching from 2 o'clock high at 300 mph, aim 3 aircraft lengths behind apparent image. The phrasing persisted because behind was easier to teach than lead ahead but compensate for tracer lag. In practice, it meant aiming into the empty space opposite the direction of closure. a learned instinct that contradicted everything the human brain demanded. The effect was measurable. By late 1943, tests at Eglin Field showed that gunners trained in compensatory aiming scored twice as many hits as untrained counterparts. The new doctrine wasn't psychological. It was mathematical. The intersection of time, distance, and motion had been translated into human reflex. Technology reinforced this new understanding. The Sperry Ball turret and Bendix remote systems used electric sight controls that responded instantly to small hand movements. Trained gunners could adjust deflection on the fly, compensating for closure speed as though operating a precision instrument. Their success was not luck. It was engineering married to physiology. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe and the Japanese Air Force still relied largely on instinctive gunnery. German pilots used reflector sights, but lacked a standardized lead computing system until late 1944. Their training emphasized aggressiveness and firing at close range, tactics that reduced the need for predictive shooting, but also increased risk. American doctrine moved in the opposite direction: rely on distance, calculation, and teamwork. Fire sooner, aim wrong, and live longer. By the winter of 1943-44, the principle had become doctrine. Gunnery manuals, training films, and simulator exercises repeated the same mantra: trust the offset, not your eyes. It was a strange faith, aiming where no enemy existed. Yet it turned chaos into geometry. This shift would soon reveal its worth not in classrooms, but in combat, where the skies of Europe and the Pacific became proving grounds for the new science of killing. Angle A. Perception under stress. No instrument in the sky worked harder than the human eye. Inside a bomber turret or fighter cockpit, the brain had to decode chaos, speed, vibration, sunlight flickering through propellers, the blur of wings crossing the horizon. Combat transformed perception into distortion. Under stress, the eye tracks motion but misjudges its rate. It lags behind acceleration and overestimates distance. To an untrained gunner, a fighter diving head-on appeared almost stationary until the last second, an illusion caused by pure geometry. When the attack came, the instinct was to fire directly at the oncoming shape. But by the time the trigger was pulled, the enemy had already passed the line of fire. Psychologists in the Army Air Forces called this the lag error. Film analysis during training revealed how gunners consistently fired where the target was, not where it would be. The result was always the same: clean misses, wasted ammunition. Combat gunners described frustration, the feeling of doing everything right, seeing tracers pass just behind the enemy's fuselage. The problem wasn't courage or discipline. It was the mismatch between human reflexes and high-speed geometry. Only conditioning, repeated, exhausting simulation, could rewire that instinct. The act of aiming behind was therefore a neurological correction. It forced gunners to break from instinct and trust abstract calculation. In the instant between sight and shot, they were fighting not just the enemy, but the deceptive rhythm of their own perception. At the Army Air Force's flexible gunnery schools, the transformation began in classrooms that looked more like laboratories than barracks. Cadets learned equations, not slogans. Instructors wrote on blackboards, time of flight to target speed to lead distance. But numbers alone weren't enough. So they built machines to teach the body what the mind struggled to grasp. One such device was the skeet trap trainer. Clay pigeons were launched at oblique angles, and gunners with shotguns had to hit moving targets without ever centering their sights. The method felt absurd at first. Aim into empty sky, squeeze, and watch the target disintegrate. Slowly, Cadets began to feel the rhythm of predictive shooting. They learned to sense the target's velocity as muscle memory rather than conscious thought. In advanced stages, airmen practiced with motorized moving targets under domed projection screens. Primitive simulators showing fighters attacking from all directions. The drill instructors would bark, "You're firing too true! You're not missing the plane. You're missing time." By graduation, aiming had become instinctive, replacing the primal urge to center on what you saw. Graduates could trace enemy flight paths, almost by reflex, calculating deflection angles subconsciously. They would carry this conditioning into the violent symmetry of real combat, where fractions of a second decided survival. What made this training revolutionary was its psychological realism. Unlike early war methods that emphasized technical proficiency, the American approach reprogrammed perception through experience. Each drill mirrored the chaos of real battle: motion, noise, and pressure. The gunner no longer thought about the rule. He felt it. Behind every calculation was a heartbeat. Veteran gunners later described how deeply unnatural the act felt. Firing into apparent emptiness, trusting mathematics over instinct. In memoirs and interviews, many admitted it never felt right, even after hundreds of missions. "You'd see him right in your sights," one B-24 gunner wrote, "and every nerve said to pull the trigger. But you held just a breath longer, aimed where he wasn't. And that's when he flew into your fire." There was a coldness to it. The human mind craves cause and effect. I see it, I hit it. But gunnery science had inverted that logic. Gunners had to kill invisibly, without the satisfaction of seeing immediate impact. Hits came half a second later, when tracers seemed to curve backward into the target. That delay, imperceptible in real time, became a metaphor for modern war itself, the separation of action from consequence. Some gunners found that knowledge unbearable. Others found peace in it. The mechanical predictability of physics offered control amid chaos. "You didn't hate them," one veteran said. "You just solved the problem in front of you." It was the mindset of a generation of airmen shaped by data precision and trust in machines. For them, aiming behind wasn't just a tactic. It was the surrender of instinct to discipline. As their skill grew, the mathematics of lead became second nature, transforming ordinary men into living extensions of their turrets. But to understand the full power of this doctrine, we must see how it reshaped not just minds, but battlefields. Air combat is geometry in motion, and doctrine turns geometry into a plan. American tactics after 1942 emphasized mutual support, measured fire, and disciplined engagement windows. Fighters were taught to use altitude and speed to set the terms of the fight. Bomber formations flew tight boxes, interlocking fields of fire that overlapped like the spokes of a wheel. Those overlapping arcs made leading the target both necessary and possible. One gunner's deflection created an invisible corridor where another could expect the attacker to cross. Commanders drilled firing discipline. Open-ended bursts were banned. Gunners were ordered to hold until the fighter entered a specified kill zone relative to the bomber's axis. That zone was defined by range brackets and deflection angles, not by the pilot's gut. Firing too early, or firing into a head-on closure, wasted rounds and left formations vulnerable. The correct timing often required aiming slightly behind the apparent aircraft track, because fighters typically crossed the bomber's beam at an angle. By coordinating timing across turrets and escort fighters, crews produced overlapping lines of lead fire that funneled attackers into predictable paths. This doctrine also reduced friendly fire. When multiple turrets fired independently at what they saw, tracer streams crisscrossed and blinded gunners. But when turrets synchronized deflection and held until set ranges, their fire became a single, coherent curtain. The effect was surgical, not chaotic. It transformed individual gunners into nodes in a network, each contributing a precise fraction to a composite solution. On the tactical level, aiming behind the target was the rule that made the network work. No doctrine survives without machines to back it. Equipment both enabled and constrained the aiming technique. Reflector sights and gyro. Leads on fighters automated parts of the calculation. When a pilot placed an attacking aircraft in the sight, the gyro would shift the reticle to compensate for the relative motion. This mechanical nudge taught the eye where to place the shot and reinforced the aim off habit. On bombers, powered turrets with stabilized guns allowed more accurate tracking and let gunners hold predicted aim points, rather than constantly swing after the target. Ammunition mattered too. The .50 caliber round had range and punch, but it also had a flight profile that demanded compensation for drop at long distances. Tracer rounds, mixed into belts to help the shooter see his pattern, burned with a visible tail that did not perfectly represent the bullet's center line. The human tendency was to chase the tracer. Training corrected that by teaching gunners to interpret tracers as a guide to correction, not a mirror of ballistics. But technology had limits. Gyro sights could fail. Turrets jammed. Weather and smoke distorted perceptions. And in the high-speed dance of fighter versus fighter, mechanical leads were less useful. The pilot's brain had to synthesize information faster than instruments could. The blend of machine and man, instrument nudges, human judgment, and practiced reflexes, was what made the aim behind technique reliable in real combat, where nothing worked perfectly. Doctrine does not exist in isolation. How the enemy fought determined which techniques would pay off. German fighters early in the war often preferred close range deflection and gunnery at intimate distances. Combat doctrine rewarded aggression and closing to within a few hundred yards. At that scale, deflection was smaller and instinctive aiming sometimes sufficed. But close fighting increased risk. American doctrine deliberately chose different trade-offs, engage at slightly longer ranges, and use prediction to reduce collisions and minimize exposure to raking fire. Japanese combat doctrine in the Pacific shared some of the German emphasis on close engagement and maneuver. That style delivered desperate aerobatics and high kill claims in certain theaters, but also meant pilots' blood fuel and took higher casualties when facing opponents who trained to predict rather than react. The Allied statistical advantage emerged where the geometry of engagement favored prediction. Long, linear intercepts against bomber streams, and coordinated escort tactics. The measurable result was stark. After widespread training and adoption of lead-centric doctrine, U.S. units reported higher hit ratios per burst and reduced ammunition expenditure per confirmed kill. Tactical analysis and after-action reports began to show the same pattern. Where American gunners trusted leading offsets and coordinated timing, enemy fighters were more likely to be downed for fewer rounds fired. Where they did not, engagements reverted to chaotic slugfests with lower efficiency. Doctrine machines and enemy habits thus formed a single ecosystem. Each influenced the others. The next part of the story is where these ideas stop being theory and begin to decide lives. The decisive battles and engagements when aiming behind doubled kills and changed air war outcomes forever. February 20, 1944. The winter light over England is thin and hard. From dawn the skies fill with silver, Long lines of B-17s and B-24s climbing into a cold, shared sky. They call it Operation Argument to the brass. Crews call it Big Week. Targets are aircraft factories deep in the Reich. Escorts will come, but the enemy will come harder. This is the proving ground. At ZO 914, a bomber stream turns toward a cluster of plants near Regensburg. Fighters peel off the clouds like knives. The first passes are brutal, fast, and chaotic. But something is different. Gunners no longer fire on sight. They wait. They hold until the attacker crosses the ordered kill sector. Until the range bracket flashes green in the trainer's mind. Not because the view looks right, but because the geometry is right. A Messerschmitt flashes across the nose of a lead B-17. A waist gunner, trained in Las Vegas months earlier, slides his sight not to the black cross, but a fraction of an aircraft, length behind it. He presses the trigger in short, measured bursts. Tracer light strips the air in straight, converging lines. The German fighter, caught by two overlapping streams from separate turrets, loses an engine and rolls toward Earth. In the first days of Big Week, after-action summaries from bomber crews repeatedly note the same pattern: coordinated, delayed bursts that converge where the attacker will be, not where he was. The change is not mystical, it is procedural. Tactics and training converge. Commanders had ordered tight formations and synchronized fire. Escorts, long-range P-51s and P-47s were available. Draw off many attackers, but those who hit the boxes encounter a network defense. When turrets fire in disciplined, short bursts at calculated deflection points, the streams form lethal corridors. Fighters trying to pass through are cut down by precisely where the mathematics predicted they would be. Contrast that with August 17, 1943, Schweinfurt, Regensburg. On that mission, the 8th Air Force accepted heavy losses. The bomber boxes flew without adequate long-range escort. Gunners responded instinctively to frantic attacks. Ammunition was expended in long, anxious sprays. The result was carnage: formations shredded, and many aircraft lost. The memory of Schweinfurt hardened command decisions. Doctrine evolved: discipline over panic, prediction over reflex. Big Week becomes the watershed. Over several days in February 1944, the Luftwaffe commits large fighter forces to protect its industry. They test the new American formula, and in several notable engagements it holds. One escorting P-51 pilot later described finding holus in the enemy formations where fighters simply did not emerge. The gunners of the bomber stream claimed them. Official 8th Air Force reports credited coordinated defensive fire, improved sighting, and better trained gunners among the factors that weakened Luftwaffe offensive capability. The air war, once a cacophony of individual duels, began to look like an engineered contest of mutually reinforcing systems. Another decisive moment came months later in the autumn of 1944 during the daytime strategic campaign over Germany. By then, bomber crews had cumulative experience, and training improvements had ripened into instinct. On a mission to Schweinfurt's rebuilt plants, an element of bomber boxes reported multiple attackers broken off in mid-pass by chains of leaded fire. Turret commanders, using prescribed deflection brackets and short, controlled bursts, watched enemy fighters disintegrate from the combined effect of interlocking fire. These engagements reveal a practical truth: the aim behind rule multiplied effectiveness because it converted individual imprecise attempts into collective, precise outcomes. One gunner's single, aimed burst was unlikely to stop a determined fighter, but 3 turrets firing at the same predicted point turned a moment into a kill. The fatal geometry was not the shot itself, but the choreography around it. The human cost of getting it right was visible. Where earlier crews had bled aircraft and men for each success, the new system conserved ammunition and better protected formations. Radio logs and debrief notes from 1944 record fewer frenzy-driven volleys and more disciplined reports. Enemy destroyed after 2 bursts from waist and tail turrets. That language is clinical, but it marks lives saved. Fewer fighters slipping through to rake a bomber's fuselage, fewer gunners left to watch their ship fall. There were dramatic single-ship stories that captured the lesson. In one mid-1944 engagement, a lone B-17 separated from its group drew a swarm of attackers. The turret crews, trained to hold and lead, fired in precise sequence. Observers on the survivor aircraft later recounted how each burst appeared to miss until the last fraction of a second, when the attacker exploded into flame as bullets from different arcs found the same point. It was testimony to the strange temporality of the technique. The hits arrive delayed, but their lethality is immediate. Tactical analysis after these missions is decisive. Engineers and gunnery officers poring over film and gun camera footage quantified what crews felt. When gunners withheld fire to achieve correct deflection, hit probability per burst went up dramatically. When turrets synchronized their timing according to doctrine, the kill probability multiplied again. The math, the machines, and the men had aligned. This alignment did not happen by accident. It followed tests, training revision, and doctrinal fixes. Memos that mandated firing windows, tables that gave precise lead distances for combinations of speed and range, and classes that rewired instinct. The sky did not become safe, it became, for the first time, systematically survivable. Those survival gains would ripple outward, into policy, into procurement, and into how entire air forces conceived of tactical defense. The battlefield had taught the lesson plainly. When American gunners trusted geometry over sight, the air war's balance shifted. Their aim no longer obeyed perception, it obeyed prediction. That realization would then force institutions to codify and spread the practice, so that doctrine could catch up with the proof. By mid-1944, the skies above Europe had become not just a battleground, but a laboratory. Every sortie yielded film, charts, and data. Every bullet's trajectory told a story, and every kill or miss was dissected with clinical obsession. From this analysis emerged a principle that could no longer be dismissed as intuition. Gunners who aim behind, according to deflection tables, not instinct, survived more often and scored more confirmed hits. At the 8th Air Force's Training Command in England, analysts began collecting combat film from the Sperry and Bendix gun camera systems. The films showed unmistakable trends. When tracers appeared to miss the target, lagging just behind its flight path, the next frame revealed impact. Conversely, when gunners fired directly at the target, rounds consistently passed in front. The paradox was not a matter of marksmanship. It was a matter of physics. The target's speed, combined with bullet time of flight and the relative motion of both aircraft, required lead angles that human perception naturally underestimated. By late summer 1944, these observations hardened into orders. Gunnery schools in the United States received urgent circulars revising their syllabi. At Las Vegas Army Airfield, the Army Air Force's Flexible Gunnery School rewrote its manuals to emphasize tracking with continuous aim and proper deflection. Instructors replaced rote firing exercises with analytical ones. Students learned to calculate angles, visualize motion, and fire short, predictive bursts. The colloquial phrasing, aim behind, became shorthand for a new mental model, one that married math to muscle memory. Simultaneously, the Army Air Force's Material Command ran controlled tests. using instrumented P-63 King Cobras fitted with sensors and cameras. Engineers simulated attack runs on bomber mock-ups. The results confirmed combat evidence. Rounds placed a few degrees behind apparent target motion consistently intersected the aircraft's projected position. These findings were published in restricted reports, such as AAF Engineering Division Report 6444, which codified the new ballistic data and recommended urgent retraining of operational units. This data-driven approach marked a quiet revolution. Air combat had long been shaped by instinct and tradition, the mythic image of the ace, the duelist. But aerial gunnery was evolving into a discipline of systems and probabilities. In post-mission briefings, officers began to speak in equations: deflection angles, range windows, burst duration. The cold precision of mathematics replaced the romance of marksmanship. It was not without resistance. Veteran gunners, especially those who had survived earlier campaigns, distrusted the abstraction. They had learned by pain and instinct. The notion of aiming at nothing felt wrong. One recalled in a debrief, "You want to fire where he isn't. That sounds like suicide." Yet the statistical returns could not be ignored. Squadrons that adhered strictly to the new gunnery discipline showed a measurable reduction in ammunition expenditure and a sharp increase in confirmed fighter kills per 1,000 rounds fired. Loss ratios improved, and bomber commanders demanded that the doctrine be standardized fleet-wide. By autumn 1944, the newly formed AF Proving Ground Command at Eglin Field formalized procedures into official manuals. Technical Order 11-1, 10 outlined site alignment, lead computation, and synchronization for turret crews. The behind technique was translated into precise degrees and mils. Instructors drilled crews to compute deflection, not by feel but by mental lookup. Integrating data from rangefinders, turret rotation speed, and attack angles. The language of doctrine spread further. In the Pacific, B-29 gunners operating from the Marianas faced different geometry, higher altitudes, faster closures, but the underlying rule held. Reports from XI Bomber Command in early 1945 confirmed the same phenomenon. Gunners who led correctly according to tables, appearing to fire behind, were those who scored kills in interceptors over Japan. What began as a European improvisation had become global policy. Technological refinements reinforced the doctrine. The introduction of computing gunsights, like the K-14 for fighters, and the improved Sperry A-1A for bombers, allowed automatic compensation for target motion. Yet even with machinery handling some of the trigonometry, the operator's instinct had to be retrained. Manuals instructed: trust the sight, not the eye. The warning captured the heart of the lesson: perception deceives in 3 dimensions, but physics does not. As doctrine solidified, the cultural identity of the aerial gunner changed. Early war propaganda had celebrated them as courageous men standing by raw courage and reflex. By 1945, they were described as technicians, operators of precision systems. Training films narrated in calm monotones replaced brash slogans. One such film, Combat Gunnery Predictive Fire, explained that the good gunner is not the fastest trigger, but the calmest mind. The battlefield had reshaped heroism, from instinct to calculation. Institutionalization reached its apex in 1945 when the AAF issued Gunnery Manual FM-145. The text codified decades of trial into doctrine. Among its core tenets, always maintain controlled bursts, always fire through the proper lead, and never trust tracer appearance alone. It formalized deflection gunnery as science, not art. What had begun as a desperate improvisation inside a freezing B-17 became printed law across the world's most powerful air arm. By war's end, the proof was unambiguous. Statistical summaries compiled after VE Day showed that average ammunition expenditure per enemy aircraft destroyed had dropped sharply from 25,000 rounds in 1943 to less than 10,000 in late 1944. A testament to disciplined, predictive fire. The aim behind doctrine had not only improved survival but efficiency. It transformed the bomber gunner from a frightened defender into a trained node in an industrialized killing machine. The war's chaos had produced its own order. Through film, analysis, and iteration, a single cognitive shift, learning to ignore what the eye insists on, became the cornerstone of air power's maturity. Doctrine had caught up with physics. The man behind the gun no longer fired at what he saw. He fired at what he knew, across the very geometry of the war. The air over Germany and Japan no longer belonged to the hunter. It belonged to the predictor. What had begun as a subtle change in how gunners pulled a trigger had matured into a revolution in how nations waged aerial combat. In the winter skies over the Reich, the difference was measurable in gun, camera film, and in the wreckage falling from 25,000 feet. Luftwaffe interceptors that once shredded bomber streams now found themselves flying through invisible curtains of plotted fire. Gunners who had mastered the aim behind rule were cutting angles of escape in advance. German pilots described tracer lines that seemed to follow before we moved. A surreal sense that the Americans were reading their intent. In truth, they were the prediction of lead. Closure rate and climb angle gave Allied crews a fractional seconds advantage. Yet that fraction, multiplied across hundreds of turrets, became the margin between loss and dominance. The effect compounded with scale. On March 18, 1945, during the Berlin raids, more than 1,200 B-17s and B-24s advanced behind a screen of escort fighters. German defenders, outnumbered and under fuel restriction, attacked in small packets. For the first time, statistical analysis afterward showed that defensive kills per sortie exceeded 1-for-1 parity. The mathematics of training, deflection angles, time of flight, convergence, had matured into the mathematics of attrition. American formations were not only surviving, they were erasing the Luftwaffe faster than replacements could train. Across the Pacific, the same logic played out at longer ranges. B-29 Superfortress crews flying from the Marianas faced interceptors diving out of cloud banks at 400 miles per hour. The distance distorted depth perception. Instinct failed. But predictive gunnery, reinforced by computing sights, restored control. Japanese Ki-84s and A-6M50s that darted through the bombers' defensive rings often disintegrated under converging fire from turrets aimed deliberately off target. Post-mission reports from the 20th Air Force logged extraordinary results, engagements lasting seconds, yet producing multiple confirmed kills with minimal ammunition. Aircrews spoke of ghost shots, bursts that seemed to miss until camera review revealed hits exactly where the manuals predicted. These outcomes did more than save aircraft. They shifted strategic rhythm. By reducing defensive losses, predictive fire enabled continuous offensive pressure. Bomber Command could mount daily strikes deeper into enemy territory without the debilitating replacement lag that had crippled earlier campaigns. Escort fighters, P-47s, P-51s, could focus on counter-air sweeps rather than constant close cover, because the bomber boxes had become self-protecting fortresses. The behind doctrine, trivial in appearance, underpinned the logistical tempo that overwhelmed Axis industry. In operational debriefs, analysts traced a clear correlation. Where units strictly enforced predictive fire training, mission completion rates rose, fuel efficiency improved, and loss ratios plummeted. By April 1945, the 8th Air Force's monthly loss rate had dropped below 1%. a figure unimaginable 2 years earlier. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later credited advanced gunnery discipline as one of the unheralded yet decisive factors enabling sustained daylight bombardment through the final year of the war. Technology magnified the change, but never replaced the mind behind it. The K-14 sight, fitted to late-war P-51Ds, provided automatic lead computation. Yet pilots still needed to trust the displaced reticle, firing at an empty patch of sky. Those who reverted to instinct, who aimed at the target itself, often missed cleanly. Combat data from the 9th Air Force showed a 2-to-1 disparity between pilots who trusted their gyro sights and those who overrode them. The doctrine's victory, in the end, was psychological faith in calculation over intuition. The lesson echoed through post-war analysis. At Wright Field, engineers collated thousands of camera reels to produce the Air Proving Ground Report Predictive Fire in Aerial Combat 1945. Its conclusion was stark. Where human perception ends, mathematics begins. The report quantified the unquantifiable. How learning to fire where the enemy would be, not where he was, doubled lethality across every platform. That insight would seed the next generation of weaponry: radar, assisted sights, analog computers, and eventually guided missiles. The modern era of predictive warfare began the moment a gunner stopped believing his eyes. For the men in the turrets, the change was subtler yet profound. Survival bred reflection. Veterans later recalled that mastering the strange discipline of aiming at empty space gave them a sense of detachment, a calm precision amid chaos. The act of firing ceased to be an outburst of fear. It became an execution of geometry. They were no longer reactive, they were predictive, part of a system larger than themselves. As the war drew to its end, the skies told the result. Fewer bombers burned on the return routes. Interceptor opposition thinned, then vanished. The quiet confidence of the gunners, those who had learned to defy instinct, became emblematic of Allied air supremacy. In a war of machines, the ultimate advantage proved to be mental, the courage to believe the equations. The guns fall silent now, but the consequences continue long after the victory reports are filed. The shift from instinctive to predictive fire changed not just how airmen fought, but how all future combat would be conceived. When the war's final reports were compiled, the numbers told a story more eloquent than any combat footage. In 1943, American bomber gunners expended roughly 25,000 rounds for every confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. By the end of 1944, after the deflection doctrine had been fully integrated, that figure fell to below 10,000. By early 1945, it dipped further still, averaging near 6,000 rounds per kill. No new weapon, no revolutionary ammunition, simply a new way of thinking. Across the 8th and 15th Air Forces, statistical analysts noted a pattern invisible to the public. Formations that enforced predictive fire procedures consistently showed twice the lethality and half the losses of those that relied on instinctive aiming. Bomber streams that once suffered catastrophic attrition over Regensburg or Schweinfurt now tore through German airspace with mathematical efficiency. On escort missions, P-51 units trained to trust their gyro sights reported 2 kills for 1, compared to earlier optical-only methods. The data vindicated every hour spent recalibrating training, every ounce of skepticism overcome. The improvement went beyond numbers. It reshaped how aircrews thought about war. No longer was victory credited to courage alone, to reflexes, luck, or heroism. Instead, it came from analysis, instrumentation, and discipline. The shift marked a cultural evolution inside the U.S. Army Air Forces, away from the lone gun mythos of the First World War toward the collective precision of modern air power. A gunner no longer fought the enemy, he solved him. The change radiated outward through doctrine and policy. By late 1945, instructors at the new U.S. Army Air Force's School of Applied Tactics in Orlando used wartime data to rewrite gunnery curriculum from the ground up. Deflection charts became standard teaching tools. The phrase, "continuous aim through lead," appeared in nearly every technical manual. When the Air Force became an independent branch in 1947, its foundational training philosophy still carried the wartime lesson: never trust what you see. Trust what the data predicts. Meanwhile, foreign observers took notice. British RAF analysts incorporated the findings into their post-war air defense systems. Soviet advisors quietly requested translated fragments of captured manuals, recognizing the predictive logic as a precursor to radar directed fire control. In Germany, surviving Luftwaffe officers admitted in debriefings that American computing, firepower, both mechanical and mental, had nullified their close attack tactics. The final air battles were less duels than demonstrations of calculation. There were human consequences, too. For many gunners, the doctrine blurred the emotional boundary of combat. Firing by mathematics, not instinct, created distance, an almost clinical separation from the act of killing. One veteran later reflected, "It felt like operating an equation, not a weapon." In this way, predictive fire foreshadowed a broader transformation in warfare: the mechanization of judgment itself. Men once trained to react were now trained to compute. The war ended with that paradox intact. By the time the guns went silent, the doctrine that had doubled kill ratios had also halved something intangible: the visceral, human link between aim and consequence. In the sterile precision of predictive fire, the future of combat was already visible: cold, rational, and devastatingly effective. The doctrine's echoes did not fade with peace. They evolved, carried into jet-age weaponry, radar systems, and the coming logic of missiles. But before those transformations took hold, the Air Force sought to understand why predictive fire had worked so completely. The success of predictive gunnery did not stay confined to bomber turrets. It migrated into doctrine, hardware development, and the strategic imagination of air forces worldwide. The practical lesson was simple and brutal: if human perception can be outpaced by calculation, then systems should be designed to do the calculating for the human. That principle shaped the Cold War before a single jet engaged another. In the immediate post-war years, gunnery instructors and weapons engineers met in labs and classrooms. They dissected gun camera reels, compared engagement tables, and translated combat wisdom into device specifications. Analog fire control computers, already nascent during the late war, took on new urgency. These electromechanical brains could accept variables: range, closure speed, target angle, and output a moving aim point for the operator. The K-14's conceptual descendants aimed to remove the final burden of human estimation. Where possible, the sights would do the math and the pilot would execute. Korea offered the first wartime test of that lineage. Jet speeds compressed engagement timelines. Deflection windows narrowed to fractions of a second. The same rule applied: the faster the fight, the more calculation mattered. Early jet engagements showed striking contrasts between pilots who relied on instrumented aids and those who trusted naked instinct. The logic of aiming ahead or behind, the visible cue, simply scaled with speed. Lessons from WWII gunnery manuals were repurposed as training doctrine for transonic air combat. Pilots were taught to trust computed reticles, to fire in controlled bursts, and to shape their pursuit to create predictable closure angles for their weapons. Beyond guns, The predictive mindset propelled guided weapon development. If a human could learn to anticipate motion, then a guided missile could be built to anticipate it faster and with greater precision. Fire control radars and lead computing directors, tools that had protected convoys and anti-air batteries in the war, were reworked for air, to air and surface, to air roles. The mathematics of deflection found new currency in radar plotting and homing algorithms. The doctrinal pivot from see and shoot to sense and compute traced an unbroken line from the Smoky B-17 turrets to the electronic suites of post-war fighters and naval ships. Institutionally, military education absorbed the change. The Air Force's early curricula emphasized sensor fusion, integrate sight, radar, and computation, then act. Tactical manuals moved away from anecdote and toward tables and flowcharts. Combat training centers used simulated engagements to instill predictive habits in jets, missiles, and crews. The language of doctrine grew clinical probability of kill, time, on target, engagement envelope. Warfare was recast as optimization. There were moral and human ramifications. Predictive systems reduced some forms of risk for operators, but increased the scale and precision of lethality. Where once a single man's marksmanship decided an outcome, now networks of sensors and computers could deliver effects with fewer intermediaries between decision and destruction. Some veterans welcomed the reduction in chaotic close in combat. Others lamented the loss of tactile skill and the distancing of judgment from the human actor. The machine made errors too, but of a different kind: algorithmic failure, sensor bias, or maintenance lapses. The trade-off became a perennial theme in military thought. On the industrial side, ordnance design shifted. Ammunition and weapon mounts were engineered to maximize returns within predicted engagement windows. Ballistic research continued. Projectiles were matched to computed firing solutions. Turret and sight manufacturers found new markets in guided sensors. Defense procurement favored systems that promised to shrink human reaction time with computation. In budget rooms and testing ranges, the arithmetic of hits per thousand rounds now guided investment decisions. Finally, the cultural memory of aerial gunnery changed. The image of the lone ace gave way to the image of the systems operator, a trained technician who read instruments and trusted models. Museums that once displayed heroics now preserve gun, camera reels, and range tables. Historians cite predictive fire as one of the quiet revolutions that turned aerial warfare into an exercise of industrial mathematics. The chain from aiming behind to contemporary targeting is not metaphorical. It is direct. A rule learned in freezing turrets, hold fire, compute lead, trust prediction, became algorithmic doctrine. That lineage explains why later conflicts emphasized sensor and computation so heavily. Once you accept that perception lags, your priority becomes shrinking that lag with instruments. The story closes on a human image. Old gunners, decades later, watch film of their own hands on chilled guns. They see the moment they learned to aim away from instinct and toward certainty. It was a small, counterintuitive act that scaled into strategic effect. That act reshaped technology, training, and the ethical contours of precision. In every photograph of an American bomber crew, one detail stands out: the eyes. Behind the goggles, they are focused not on the horizon, but on something imagined just beyond it. That invisible space, the place where a target will be, not where it is, defines the entire philosophy of modern warfare. The rule that taught airmen to aim behind was never just a trick of marksmanship. It was the moment when human perception conceded to physics, when instinct gave way to calculation. For the first time in history, A soldier's success depended not on what he felt, but on what he predicted. In that surrender to mathematics, a new kind of warfare was born, one driven by data, foresight, and probability. What began in the bitter cold of a bomber turret, men tracing arcs across the sky, trusting numbers over nerves, became the DNA of precision itself. Every radar track, every missile guidance law, every computer-driven weapon inherits that same idea that victory belongs not to the fastest reflex, but to the mind that anticipates. Yet behind the equations and angles lies something profoundly human. The discipline to act against instinct, to fire where there is nothing, demands faith. Faith in training, in reasoning, in unseen truth. It is the quiet courage of those who learned that survival depended not on reaction, but on restraint. They aimed into emptiness and found accuracy. They trusted abstraction and found certainty. Today, the world of sensors, algorithms, and autonomous targeting traces its lineage to those moments above Europe and the Pacific. To those gunners' eyes calculating, lead under freezing winds, believing that physics could outthink fear. Their lesson endures beyond the war that birthed it. That clarity is not seeing better. It is understanding before seeing. And so, the sky itself became a classroom, a place where humanity learned that even in chaos, prediction is power, and that sometimes the surest way to strike truth is to aim just behind what you see.